Hey everybody, I want to drop a little video here. It's probably not going to be little anymore. I tend not to do little videos. Hopefully, I can get this done in about 30 minutes because there's a lot of material I need to cover, and it's related to something I'm seeing more and more. It's become really popular, kind of cool for people to write little articles or post little snarky videos or make passing comments in books saying that the rapture is not in the Bible, that the rapture, that the actual literal catching up at some point of the saints into the air at the return of Christ, however a person times that out eschatologically, that forget the timing of the rapture, it's not an event at all. Now, I do want to clarify before we get into the question itself here. There are some people who say the rapture is not in the Bible, and by that they mean the word rapture is not in the Bible. Sure, that's clear. The word rapture in English is related to the Latin verb rapere, which is translating harpazo, and so that is in the Bible. Harpazo, the snatching away. It's used several times in the New Testament, and in the Latin Vulgata, the rapere verbs are also, and now related nouns are also used in the Bible. So if someone's saying that rapture is not in the Bible and they just simply mean they open up the Bible app and search for rapture, sure, that's granted. But the word Bible's not in the Bible. The word Trinity is not in the Bible. There's a lot of things that aren't in the Bible, but they're English words that are used to translate or explain a certain doctrine. What oftentimes people mean when they say the rapture is not in the Bible is that the pre-tribulation rapture is not in the Bible. That is, you have a future 7-year tribulation period, and prior to that tribulation, that's when this catching up of the saints in First Thessalonians 4:17 is going to occur. And or they mean the mid-trib, or a pre-wrath, or a post-trib. They would say basically everything's happening at one time post-trib. So if they mean by the rapture's on in the Bible, the pre-trib rapture's on in the Bible, but they acknowledge that there is some sort of event of the rapture, that is the assumption into heaven or the catching up of the saints into heaven. If they mean that, then that's a discussion we can have. Oftentimes, when people say they don't believe that there's a rapture in the Bible, meaning a pre-tribulation rapture, what in their eschatology, they've already decided that there is no actual future tribulation period. And if there's no future tribulation period, that we're just going to kind of go along and things are going to be either stay the same or get worse and worse, and then Jesus is going to come back and dead will be raised and we'll be caught up and all of that, it'll happen all at the same time, then that's fine. That's a different kind of eschatology. But if you hold to a future period of day of the Lord, judgment or tribulation or something of that nature, then the question of when will this rapture event occur relative to the future tribulation becomes a question. So I'm not talking about people who say the word rapture is not in the Bible, or people who say the pre-trib or mid-trib or pre-wrath rapture is not in the Bible, meaning a timing. I'm talking here about people who say, ha ha ha, you silly people who talk about the timing of the rapture, you're silly because it's never going to happen. In other words, there will be no moment when a believer's feet, resurrected or not, will leave the ground. Okay, that the event described in First Thessalonians 4:17 is not an actual departure of resurrected, glorified, transformed saints from the earth into some heavenly realm. That is a metaphor. So Ben Witherington, there are several people, and I'm going to mention a couple of names. I love and respect these people. I don't regard them as, apostates from the faith per se or whatever. But usually from the realm of kind of a more moderate New Testament studies kind of perspective, they have come to the conclusion that when Paul describes the dead in Christ will rise first, and then we who are alive will be caught up together, harpazo, with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, that is not describing a literal event of being caught up into the clouds, that it is a metaphor. So Ben Witherington writes, it should be clear, and I'm going to read a few quotes throughout this presentation. He says, it should be clear from the beginning of verse 16 that Christ is said to come down out of heaven and meet his followers somewhere else. Well, my comment, it says in the air. Anyway, he says the meeting does not take place in heaven, so there is no rapture into heaven here. The text does say, "We will, the Lord will himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel and trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first, and then we who are alive will be caught up together with them into the air, um, to meet the Lord in the air." So usually a literal catching up of the saints is dispensed with then by an appeal to a Greco-Roman background that authors like Witherington and N.T. Wright and a friend of mine, Mike Bird, has said the same thing. And then numerous YouTubers who are reading these books and articles and hearing these interviews and different things where they're kind of snarkily making fun of rapture people. They appeal to a Greco-Roman background. And so N.T. Wright puts it this way. This is pretty classic, and you'll hear this all over in YouTubedom. He says, when the emperor visited a colony or province, the citizens of the country would go to meet him at some distance from the city. When they met him, they wouldn't then stay out in the open country. They would escort him royally into the city itself. And then the result is, this is where the metaphorical use of Paul's meeting, the idea of we meeting the Lord in the air comes in. N.T. Wright continues, when Paul speaks of meeting the Lord in the air, the point is that having gone out to meet their returning Lord, they will escort him royally into his domain, that is, back to the place they have come from. And so the idea is the image that Paul is describing is like an emperor coming to a city to liberate it and visit or whatever. Christ is coming to his realm, the world, then we go out to meet him, and then we return back to the city. But because it's a metaphor, that going out to meet him isn't actually going to happen per se. He comes from the air. We meet the Lord in the air, who is coming in the air, and then we usher him back into the city. That's metaphorical. It's vivid, poetic, almost apocalyptic, symbolic, metaphorical language. The on-the-ground reality is feet never leave the ground. That's how it's understood. So Wright then appeals to all kinds of Old Testament passages, various other kinds of backgrounds, etc., and tries to describe what Paul is actually doing there. I deal with all of his backgrounds as well as some logical and rhetorical fallacies involved in them in an article on the Fathers on the Future website, which I'm kind of summarizing the contents of that. It's Go Deeper Excursus 28, where I get into all of the details. I have those quotes. I have all of the footnotes and references. If you're interested in where these quotes and things are coming from, just go there. It's the article called "The Rapture of the Church" in 1 Thessalonians 4:17 as an actual event. But my point here is the dismissal of the rapture catching up as an event is done by an appeal to this Greco-Roman background, which apparently is so well understood in Paul's day that everybody would have read Paul knowing that this was a metaphor. N.T. Wright goes on, he says that these two verses in 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17 then have been grievously abused by those who have constructed out of them a big picture of a supposed rapture. Quotes are his. This has had the effect not only on popular fundamentalism, but on a fair amount of New Testament scholarship, which has assumed that Paul really meant what the fundamentalists think he meant. So even New Testament scholars, which is a lot of them, reading Paul's words and say, yeah, Paul believed that we were going to be caught up in the air. Even unbelieving scholars say, yeah, that's what Paul said. I don't believe it, but that's what Paul believed. And so it's a bit of an uphill battle for those who want to say that there is no actual literal rapture, because, as we'll see in a little bit later, everybody in the history of the church until the modern era believed that there was a rapture. All right, kind of moving forward, N.T. Wright and others say, Paul has in mind Exodus 19 and the ascent of Moses onto Mount Sinai, and Daniel 7 and the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds is part of his background, etc. But most of it is driven by, Paul is appealing to this very common Greco-Roman background of a king visiting a city. And that's the idea of the official party going out to meet him and greet him, kind of a meet and greet outside the city to usher him back. And that's all that's going on here. It's just a metaphor. So it has been claimed that, therefore, apanthesis, this meeting, it literally says, we'd be caught up unto a meeting or unto a meeting for the purpose of a meeting in the air, is a kind of technical term. So obviously not in the air, but the idea of the apanthesis, the meeting itself, is a almost technical term for sending a greeting party to meet this royal dignitary. And this, the problem is this idea, this apanthesis, this meeting, is the way it's treated by the metaphorical interpreters is it's almost approaching the semantic fallacy of making false assumptions about a technical meaning or unwarranted restriction of semantic field. Also, what I would call a careless appeal to background material. It's taking a background that is maybe plausible, that someone has made a case for, and loading that into this term. And listen, the term itself cannot bear that weight. So this really kind of comes from, there's some prior to this, but it really gets off the ground in a 1930 article by a German scholar, Erich Peterson. He has made the case that that apanthesis is a technical term for this formal reception. And then people kind of picked up on this and said, yeah, there goes the rapture. Forget pre, mid, post, partial, pre-wrath, whatever. There's no rapture at all. And people kind of picked this up and ran with it and tried to strengthen it. In about 6 decades later, by an author named Michael Cosby, in an article in it's the Bulletin for Biblical Research in 1994, he attempted to take Peterson's work and strengthen it and do more exhaustive work to demonstrate that this is, in fact, a very common understood background and idiom for a greeting party going out and thus dismantling the rapture. It's really interesting because Cosby's research sort of backfired on him. And I'm going to read a couple excerpts from his article. He writes, "The journey into this research forced me to confront my own deeply held biases. I still detest what I perceive to be the misguided teaching on the rapture of the church in some Christian circles because of the abuses it produces. So I did not want to face the possibility that Peterson's interpretation was incorrect, since it was such an effective and easy means of dispensing with the fanciful notion of the rapture." So listen, this is very important. I suspect, I can't prove this, I suspect, based on the snarkiness of the tone and the triumphalistic kind of attitude that you see among the YouTubers dismissing the rapture by appealing to this background, I suspect that the same motivation is driving them as well. This effective and easy means of dispensing with the whole notion of the rapture discussion. So a little bit later, Cosby faces the conundrum. He says, "A man with a mission, I sought to locate further texts describing Hellenistic formal reception so that the case would be airtight and the information readily accessible. When I first began to see some problems with the theory, I did not want to face them. Only after a period of about a year was I able to admit the possibility that Peterson's exegesis was eisegesis. With great hesitation, I carefully examined the data, and honesty forced me to admit I had been wrong. In a way, this was a triumph, for it illustrated again the power of the text to transform the view of the reader." And I commend him for that. At this point, he continues, "At this point, with only a small amount of residual resentment, I admit that the text of 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 17 leaves open the matter of whether or not the Christians are caught up in the air in order to escort the Lord back to earth. By comparing this passage with the other New Testament texts that speak of the parousia, it remains clear, at least to me, that the parousia in Paul's mind included divine reward of the righteous and judgment of the wicked. But honesty forced me to diffuse the most effective bomb in my historical arsenal that so readily destroys the fanciful notion of the rapture. How much of our scholarship do we perform while looking over our shoulders at the beliefs of our youth that have become sources of embarrassment to us as scholars? End quote. So this is a commendable and bold admission. Since then, other people have attempted to say, no, 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 don't give up. We can strengthen this still. And so I do want to acknowledge, and I do in the article that I'm going to direct you to, um, the term apantesis has been kind of picked up and defended by people like Robert Gundry, attempted to salvage the Hellenistic reception background, uh, but he fails. He ends up having to appeal to passages that have nothing to do with First Thessalonians 4:15 through 17. Does not address really the greatest problem surfaced by Cosby's investigation, the numerous non-technical uses of apantesis in Greek literature. So the fact is, it's yes, sometimes apantesis, a meeting, is used for a formal reception of a dignitary. But not all the time. It's not a technical term for that. If I say apantesis in the first century, people are not going to immediately think of dignitary coming to visit the city. They're going to think meeting. What kind of meeting? Well, it could be going out to meet your in-laws as they're coming to visit the house. It could be going out to meet a dignitary. It could be going out to meet an army. The Septuagint uses the phrase a lot of times, often in reference to one army from the city going out to meet another army that is advancing for precisely the purpose of not letting them back into the city. So it is not true that it is a technical term at this time. One more time, I'm just going to quote Cosby briefly. He says, the dominant scholarly understanding of the apantesis in 1 Thessalonians 4:17, based on the work of Peterson, does not sufficiently account for the differences between Paul's words and descriptions of receptions of dignitaries. All of the main elements of Hellenistic receptions found in ancient papyri, inscriptions, and literature are missing from 1 Thessalonians 4:15 through 17. Other people have done, in my book and as well as other online resources, I've done a lot of examination of the actual language in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, that passage, and looking at what is the real background of Paul's language there. And I direct you to that. In 2012, Candida Moss and Joel Baden, they authored an article suggesting, in fact, that 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18 depends on rabbinical backgrounds. And they note a closer examination of rabbinic texts pertaining to the day of the Lord. This is the background I make a case for in Fathers on the Future. They say, to the day of the Lord, they go on, will reveal that there were traditions in which the righteous escaped judgment and destruction in Sheol by flying and being borne aloft by clouds. And they go on. You can take a look at that as well. So the discussion on the precise backgrounds and every little term is still kind of up in the air. I think the overwhelming case can be made that the background is Old Testament and intertestamental Day of the Lord imagery, and we can take a look at that in the book itself. But in light of this, I think those Old Testament, intertestamental, and rabbinical backgrounds have a prima facie greater weight than some sort of imagined reception of a dignitary in the Greco-Roman world, especially since those backgrounds are disputed, ambiguous, and Paul doesn't have enough actual terms in the text to actually warrant that. And so those of you who want to insist on posting more and more and more of these YouTube videos saying there's no such thing as a rapture, you really need to deal with the papyri inscriptional evidence. Cosby provides all kinds of material there, and more has been surfaced since then, more articles and things. And I put those in the article that I'm referring to and reading some excerpts from. So also, please keep in mind that the apantesis, the unto a meeting of the Lord, is not the only term in the text. The rapture term itself is not the apantesis. That's the purpose of the rapture, unto a meeting of the Lord. The term rapture itself, harpazo, is definitely not a technical term for a party going out to meet somebody out in the field. In fact, it's a It is an involuntary snatching from one place to another. So 1 Thessalonians 4:17, harpazo is used elsewhere. Paul himself uses the term in 2 Corinthians 12:2-4. Keep this in mind. Think about what Paul means by the term that he uses in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. He says in 2 Corinthians 12, I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up, harpagenta, to the third heaven. Metaphorically or literally. He says, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. And I know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows, was caught up, herpage, into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. Paul uses the term for a literal snatching out of this realm into the heavenly realm, just like he uses in 1 Thessalonians 4, where he says, the dead in Christ will rise first, and we who are left will be caught up together with them into the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So the lexical, the exegetical, the background, the contextual, none of this points to a clear, obvious Greco-Roman background of a party going out to meet an emperor on the road, and therefore our feet stay on the ground because it's just a metaphor. I don't want to be mean, but it's totally made up. And it was made up in the last 100 plus years. The vast majority of the history of the church understood, and regardless of whether they were futurists or preterists or premillennial or amillennial, it doesn't matter what their eschatology was, they understood that what Paul described in 1 Thessalonians 4 was a rapture. I'm talking about people, especially these earliest fathers, who were, cussed with their friends in Greek and were yelled at by their mothers in Greek. They understood that when Paul said we would be caught up in the air, that meant a literal catching up. And I've cataloged this in a lot of detail in the article that I mentioned, in going from Irenaeus all the way deep into the patristic period. And I could keep on, but the point is very clear. I'm not cherry picking. Do the work yourself if you don't trust me. This is a result of surveying all of the fathers, taking a look at what they actually believed about these things. The earliest Christian readers of 1 Thessalonians 4:17 understood the catching up of the transformed, living, and resurrected dead saints to refer to a literal future event, not a metaphor for something other than the assumption of the church. So Irenaeus, I'm just going to rattle them off. You can read the descriptions yourself. I might read a couple brief excerpts. Irenaeus of Lyon in the 2nd century and Against Heresies 5:29-1. He says, therefore, when in the end the church shall be suddenly caught up from this, repente hinc ecclesia sumitur, in Latin, it is said there will be tribulation such as has not been since the beginning, neither shall be. Clement of Alexandria, almost certainly not a premillennial list. Also, in Stromata 6:14, he describes the catching up of the saints and then their growth from glory to glory. Tertullian of Carthage in several places, Against Marcion 3:25, Against Marcion 5:15, Against Marcion 5:20, Treatise on the Soul 55, on the Resurrection 41. He talks about the literal catching up of the saints in fulfillment of 1 Thessalonians 4:17. Origin of Alexandria against Celsus 5:17 266, on First Principles 11:5-6, being caught up. He says, then if that atmosphere which is between heaven and earth is not devoid of inhabitants and those of a rational kind, as the apostle says, wherein in times past ye walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who is now worketh in the children of disobedience. Again, he says, we shall be caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. He goes on, he says, we are therefore to suppose that the saints will remain there until they recognize the twofold mode of government in those things which are performed in the air. He's literally taking that passage as catching up into the air elsewhere. Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century against the Eunomius 12:1, on the making of man 22:6. Methodius of Olympus in the 4th century concerning chastity 6:4. John Chrysostom, I love this. He says, and he said all this also when he was speaking concerning a resurrection. For the Lord himself, it is said, shall descend from heaven with a shout with the voice of the archangel. So that when risen again, the angels shall gather them together when gathered together the clouds shall catch them up, and all these things are done in a moment, in an instant. For it is not that he abideth above calleth them, but he himself cometh with the sound of a trumpet. And what means the trumpets and the sound? They are for arousing, for gladness, to set forth the amazing nature of the things then doing, for grief to them that are left. John Chrysostom, homily 76, 4, homily 8 on 1 Thessalonians 4:15-17. Read that whole thing. He very clearly holds to a catching up into the clouds when the Lord comes. Rufinus of Aquileia, 4th century. Aphrahat the Persian. Ephraim the Syrian in the 4th century. Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century. Theodorus of Cyrus in the 5th century. And St. Jerome in the 5th century as well. And everybody else, the vast majority, understand that Paul just simply means what he says. It matches the text, it matches the meaning of the words, it fits the context. Listen, you can argue against a timing of the rapture, pre-mid, pre-wrath, etc., and say it's just a rapture is going to happen when Christ returns. You can even say that the rapture is just a catching up and then they come right back down. But what you can't say and be a responsible scholar is that it's just a metaphor and it's never going to happen. Well, you can say that. You can actually say that because freedom of religion, First Amendment, you can say whatever you want. It doesn't match the text as it would have been understood in the 1st century, as it was understood by Christians of every eschatological background. And it doesn't fit this speculative, fallacy-filled defense appealing to a Greco-Roman background of a meeting of a dignitary as he's coming to earth. It's really the burden of proof. I'm going to just state this outright. The burden of proof is not on us who understand Paul to be referring to a literal catching up. The burden of proof is not on us. It's not, because the classic history, unanimous view of the church all the way through by people who don't have a dog in this fight is that this is an actual literal event. So please, please, please stop with the nonsense. You sound foolish saying that there's no rapture. We can talk about when it's going to be, whether it's distinct from the parousia and the coming of Christ. But please, for the love of all that is good and true, stop trying to snarkily and snidely dismiss people who are discussing the rapture by saying, there's no rapture, it's just a metaphor.